Namaste and greetings. I, Haran, researcher at IMPRI, Impact and Policy Research Institute, Prabhavi Niti Anusandhan Sansthan, Nai Delhi, extend my warmest welcome to you all to IMPRI #Web Policy Learning. Today, we are gathered here for day 3 of Careers in Public Policy, an online national Monsoon workshop program, a 3-day immersive online introductory career counseling and awareness certificate training workshop. Push yourself to the next level, learn, interact, and discuss with the top experts in the field. So this training program is organized by IMPRI as a unique initiative for career counseling. This program has an excellent panel for experts who will be sharing their expertise for a 3-day immersive online introductory career counseling and awareness certificate training workshop. The distinguished expert panel includes Dr. Nivedita P. Haran, Professor Mukul, Ms. Urvashi Prasad, Mr. Sandeep Chachra, Shri Amit Dubey, and Mr. Yash Agarwal. The conveners for this course are Professor Vibhuti Patel, Visiting Distinguished Professor IMPRI, former Professor, Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Mumbai, Dr. Devender Singh, Senior Visiting Fellow, IMPRI, former National Program Officer, UNFPA India, Mr. Yash Agarwal, Founder, Public Policy India, Dr. Simi Mehta, CEO and Editorial Director at IMPRI, and Dr. Arjun Kumar, Director at IMPRI. I welcome you all to this enlightening deliberation and thank you for putting your time, energy, and efforts into truly understanding the need related to the crucial role that policymaking plays in shaping the future of any country. So before we start today's session, I would like to announce the housekeeping rules. First, it is imperative that you join the meeting on time. There will be a Q&A session after each presentation. Share your questions in the Q&A box and not in the chat box. The questions must not be posted as an anonymous attendee. Ensure that your questions are precise and refrain from making journal comments in the question to save time. So our session for day 3 will cover the topics of civic engagement, community building, and careers in public policy, working with multiple stakeholders for social transformation by Sandeep Chachra and skills for a career in public policy, part 2 by Mr. Yash Agarwal. So now, moving forward, I would like to request Mr. Sandeep sir. He is an executive director of Section 8 Association India, former co-chair of the World Urban Campaign coordinated by UN Habitat, editor of Agrarian South, Journal of Political Economy, advisor IMPRI. Start the session with civic engagement, community building, and careers in public policy, working with multiple stakeholders for social transformation. Over to you, sir.
Well, thank you. Thank you. And I'm honored to be here for many reasons. Of course, I have been associated with IMPRI in some of your programs, Dr. Arjun, so it's an honor to be here and always good to be with IMPRI colleagues. I'm honored also because Professor Dr. Nivedita Haran is chairing the panel. So glad to be here in this with you, ma'am. And particularly interested since I was informed that very interested participants who are looking at public policy as an arena of further work are joining us today. So very warm welcome to you all. I plan to keep, if that's fine with you, Dr. Arjun and Dr. Haran, I plan to keep this session more in an interactive mode because I fundamentally believe that that's the best way to look at the question of careers. And more importantly, I think it is better to do it in a sharing mode where I can bring in bits and parts of my personal learnings over the years, working in a civil society organization and a lot of time with social movements and community processes into this discussion and learning. Just to sort of say that in the last 3 decades, what you would call a professional life, which I would call a time of service, my time has been spent with particularly and directly, I'm an anthropologist by training, actually, a social anthropologist. So even when I was a student, I learned and marveled at this idea of participant observation with the tribal communities in Jharkhand. So from there on, my time of the last 3 decades, less so now, given the kind of leadership role responsibilities, but a large part of this 3 decades has been spent very close to number one vulnerable communities in India, which you know about, whether it's indigenous or what we call in India tribal people. It's an important distinction with other struggling communities, whether it's pastoralists, nomadic pastoralists, whether it's what's called in our law and policy denotified tribes, whether it is agricultural workers. I also happen to edit a global journal published by SAGE for the last, I think, about 12 years, called Agrarian South, which is a journal devoted to agrarian issues, which is peasant and workers' issues. So I associate with those processes on the ground, apart from doing academic work on it, but also in my responsibilities in ActionAid over these last 2.5 decades, which I have been with ActionAid in India, but also in Myanmar and in China, and but also in Africa, in different African countries, 5 of them. Also with groups which have oppressed histories, which have continued burdens of history, and which struggle to make their voices heard and agendas changed with reference to what is called public policy, with reference to what is called, I think, more just and equal futures through the instrument called public policies, which, as I'm one of the later speakers today, as you would know, what public policy is, who are the public policy functionaries in a typical sense. So I will not get into those definitional issues, but should you have questions, I'm happy to welcome it. What I do want to say, and I want to focus on, is the fact that typically and traditionally, public policy in the textbooks, you will find it. Of course, there's newer references which are changing and evolving, but typically and traditionally and importantly, in any given state, particularly in welfare states, public policy making and public policy setting and public policy implementation is the role of the state, and therefore the functionaries of the state. In an elected system, in a democratic system, in a welfare state, that is the premise or the arena for publicly elected representatives, as we call them in the Indian context. Let's say the local, starting from the local to much more importantly at the state level, the legislators, and obviously the parliamentarians in different houses of the parliament. Obviously, in this function, an important role is played by public public officials, and who in our context is called the bureaucrats in a broader sense, in different arenas and different realms, who are actually, and importantly, people who draft the policies and for the legislators to then enact, debate, and change and shape them. But increasingly, over past decades, I think this goes back to about 3 or 4 decades, but it's not only limited to 3 or 4 decades. The role of other formations, the role of other interests are becoming more and more important. How much of it is desirable or not is a debate, which is an evolving debate. And we can address it as we discuss issues, but increasingly becoming certainly important. In that, what I'm going to be talking a little bit more on, overemphasizing, is the role of people's organizations, people's formations, communities themselves, people who are affected themselves, and people who wish to see the protagonists, the central people who wish, for whom policies are made. I'm going to come on this sort of presentation, a very brief presentation, just a few ideas to warm you up for your questions from the perspective of vulnerable and marginalized sections of our society, whether it's communities, whether it's different groups, demographic groups, and so on and so forth. And in this context, let me say the follows. I have a few points for here. See, increasingly, just before I go there, increasingly also, as this space expands and sees contestation, regression, and progression both, in the evolving nature of our democratic functioning. As this space expands, more and more, and this is reflected in both in the academia, but also reflected in the kind of teaching that goes on, in the kind of jobs people get, in the kind of job market needs that are there. So increasingly, we see a range of things happening. So you will see a range of, I have noticed when I was a student, there were none. This is about 30 years ago. Increasingly, we see specialized courses, both at graduate and postgraduate levels, on public policy, national development, international development. Increasingly, we see roles in teaching coming up on public policy, roles in research available for public policy. Increasingly, we see consulting firms recruiting public policy professionals. Increasingly, also in the private sector, there are demands for public policy. And these days, the last decade or decade and a half, I have noticed that the elected officials also now want to recruit younger or desirous or capable public policy professionals to help them interpret and draft policies. Now, these come in the shape of young professional programs or programs of legislative sort of support. So various shapes. Increasingly, those recruitments go on. And over these past 3 decades, increasingly, I see spaces for public policy experts and specialists, professionals among more what is called NGO sector or civil society organization, academia, I mentioned, but also more traditionally the NGO sector. For instance, ActionAid itself, we are a 50-year-old organization. And if I were to look at ActionAid associations past 50 years, in the last 25 years or so, in the first 25, there were none. But in the last 25 years or so, we have specialized policy units and policy departments doing policy research, public policy research, wanting to do contributions to ongoing debates in public policy, for instance, currently on the Uniform Civil Code, or a couple of years ago on the labor code. So that's an expanding area. Now, with reference to what I do want to come is where I see the most important need. Yes, this is happening, and we can talk about all of this. What are the possibilities of careers? What are the kind of skills needed? What's the kind of sort of futuristic issues that one can work on? We'll discuss all that as you ask me questions. But let me focus a bit on what I see as the most important arena of social need for future, where I see from my experience and from my reflections, directly engaging these issues on the ground and in social organizations with public policy officials, what I see as an arena which will be more and more needed and socially needed for the coming decades and perhaps even more. So for one, I see the need focused on communities which have unequal paths, which have unjust paths, and which in the spirit of nation building, which in the spirit of social progress, which in the spirit of what is called a collective advance and egalitarian advance, we need much more support and emphasis. And to me, these in our Indian context, and we can go to different countries, there's lots of generalizations possible, which to me essentially are communities which are today considered by various yardsticks, those facing vulnerability, marginalization, inequality, you can name them. Essentially, communities which have had oppressed past, unequal past, consigned with those burdens of history, as I may call them, today form our majorities in every single country, a large section of our society, and those for whom equal and just futures, as I call them, are not just a social need, a historical necessity as well. Of course, along with these are those past ones, past issues. There are also current impacts of a lot of change. For example, climate change issues, for example, growing ecological crisis. So to those oppressed past, to those unjust histories and those burdens are also getting added newer and newer sort of forces which consign those who are already poor, those who are already vulnerable, yet greater risk. One of those, for example, is the question of climate change, but there are several others. For instance, more and more, religion is becoming an axis on which inequalities play out. For instance, economic inequalities are becoming an axis in the kind of growth models we have, in the kind of development models we have, in the kind of market-led development models we have, on which economic inequalities are also becoming a new arena of greater burdens and greater marginalization. There are several other issues. And in this context, I think the key arena where I would sort of want draw your attention to is an arena of how the central question, how do we work, how do we empower, how do we ensure that those who are impacted most are able to have the power to, have the ability to make the change or wish to make the change, and therefore engage public policy processes for future. And in that, how they can set the agendas for public policy in future. To me, the central question is around that arena of how should the central question of how should those who are impacted most would make the change happen in the years to come. And therefore, what kind of efforts should be directed to make that happen? Should be directed by the society, by social organizations, by public organizations, by other stakeholders to make that a real possibility. So that's the central question. And to me, that's the most important arena for future for what is called here careers in public policy. So that's one point I'll make. And to me, I'll throw out a few ideas from what I've seen in that reference. The first of those is, of course, we have felt that the question of agenda setting becomes central in any public policy making. The central question always is, who sets the agenda and what kind of agenda is set? So that's the central question. So that's one arena where I think, honestly, that public policy personnel, call them professionals, call them activists, call them people who want to make change, have a very, very important role to play in building the capacities, the opportunities, and the possibilities for people to do that agenda setting. And then to define what kind of public policies need to come from there. That would be, in my opinion, what I call democratic policy making, or by those, with views of those, with centrality of those who are going tomorrow to bear the burden of that policy, to bear the benefits of that policy, and to bear the outcomes and face the outcomes of such policies. In that regard, I find that in agenda setting, the role of participatory action researches become very, very central. I'll give you an example from a recent ongoing work. A lot of people, particularly the workers of India, the nomadic pastoralists, the sugarcane cutters, the other agricultural workers, the fisher folk of India, the urban construction workers of India, the riverine communities of India, express and talk about this need on account of the disasters, climate-induced disasters. This is currently going on. This is current example I wanted to give you. How climate-induced disasters, how climate-induced displacements and other hardships are impacting their lives. In this regard, the role of community action researchers, or what I call participatory action researchers, in bringing communities together, developing the problematic, looking at the ground evidence, collecting the ground evidence, and using that ground evidence at the local level, conscientizing the communities themselves, members of different stakeholders groups within their own setups, pastoralists, for instance. More recently, we have done 3 studies of participatory action researches by them, led by them, framed by them, agenda set by them in terms of pastoralism, nomadic pastoralism, in terms of fisher folk, and in terms of sugarcane cutters in the Deccan Plateau. So developing consciousness, social consciousness, developing what needs done, therefore taking what needs done to the local processes, whether be at the district level, the Zilla level, whether be at the panchayat level, or definitely at the state level through the legislators, becomes a central arena of agenda setting. So this role is, I think, fundamental, both in developing their own protagonism, construction, leadership, consciousness, but also equally well in defining a public policy ask with different levels of public policy making. Furthermore, I think this whole question of developing proposals in terms of not just in terms of what policies need to be, but in terms of what budgets will be needed, what financials will be needed, is also a way of agenda setting. So that's one arena that I'd like to focus on. The second arena is, and then of course the legislative domain that I mentioned. The third arena is the arena of using judicial mechanism, media and judicial mechanism to outline, ask their demands, or using the mechanism of public interest litigations, which is very well known. I mean, we have seen several policies come out from protagonists through the instrument of, although it's time consuming, but through the arena of public interest litigations. To name a few, if I may recall, in the long past, wonderful policies have resulted as a result of public interest litigation. To name a few, if you may remember in the 80s, 70s or 80s, the case of Bandhua Mukti Morcha with the Union of India, where the focus was on the question of child labor and the banning of child labor through the case that public interest litigation that Bandhua Mukti Morcha fought with the Union of India and won, and therefore had as a result an outcome of prevention of child labor, policies related to prevention of child labor. More recently, and directly our own experience as ActionAid has been, and I was one of the litigants in the public interest litigation, the case of shelters for urban homeless. So I remember in the year 2004-5, together with homeless people in different cities of India, as a joint litigation, PIL, we had undertaken ground action researches led by homeless people on the number of cold wave deaths in 5 cities of India. And that construed the basis of what then became the public interest litigation and what eventually became, 10 years into the process, on an evolving basis, the Supreme Court directions to the Government of India to develop a national policy and scheme for 24/7 shelters, night shelters, or 24/7 shelters later for all the urban homeless in all the cities of this country. So that was also an instance through which public interest litigation example, through which a progressive public policy with the ideas and the leadership of homeless people, a select group of homeless people across different countries happened. Similarly, you may remember the case of Vishaka guidelines. There's a whole range of others, just to give you a few instances. So public interest litigations is another arena, apart from action researches, apart from media advocacy and media write-ups and thinking, apart from legislative processes at the local to the national level, that requires support from public policy people, public policy community, to ensure that such leaderships flourish, to ensure that such capacities are supported, to ensure that these processes happen. to seek expert feedback into the same. So those are the arena that I can speak about. Another arena of public policy making is where support is needed by those affected is the arena of the local self-governments. And I have mentioned this in the passing, but under the Panchayati Raj reforms, both in urban and in rural areas, the 73rd and the 74th amendments, that's an arena where a lot of public policy work would be futuristic, and therefore a lot of support to do that public policy work would be really sort of valuable and much needed. In that context, let me say, thank you. In that context, let me also say that in the life cycle of public policy, and I want to give a few pointers on that before opening it up for further discussions. Agenda setting is one part which I'm speaking to. Policy formulation is another part which I'm speaking to. Policy formulation requires a range of expertise and expert inputs, and that therefore means that those who are doing policy formulation, largely right now in the civil service, this happens, or in the legislative domain, this happens. But as it expands, the quality or the skill sets required are a range of skill sets. So both the levels of research skills, the levels of skills to do ground and evidence building researches, whether it's through action researches, participatory action researches, or through other kinds of researches. The question of thinking through, which needs exposure to both, in my view, to both not just the conditions of on the ground, but also to what's happened in the past, what have been the successes in the past, what has been the responses in the past, and what is needed for future, a projection of those, but also equally well within the local sphere, within the national sphere, but also within the international sphere. For instance, recently, a few years ago, and together with IMPRI, I made those presentations here earlier, we were looking at what is possible to do under the amendments proposed for the labor codes. One of the labor codes, 2020 or 2021, which was formulated, was on social security. So in order to do so, not only the public policy set of people had to do those evidence building exercises, had to ensure that the workers' voices, these are labor codes, right, that focused on informal workers, had to give the leadership to the workers' views and voices, informal workers of India, which constitute large majorities of India. So carry out those processes, carry out those consultations, carry out that agenda building. But also at the same hand, on the other hand, had to sort of look at what has been the past promises on social security, what is the current situation, and what would be the best way going forward in the context of equality and justice that I spoke of. But equally well, they had to look at what are progressive practices elsewhere in the world. And in this regard, I want to give an example where ActionAid and academia in India, the JNU in this case, and certain other institutions, had done a series of studies looking at and these were participatory studies looking at what informal workers want, how a series of consultations in that regard, setting the agenda in that regard, but also a series of studies internationally to look at comparators, to look at what is happening elsewhere in the world. The latest of those studies over the last few years, I had the opportunity to share here, which is a study of social security policies of 4 countries in the world. And those are China, Brazil, Germany, and India. And there, the public policy researchers, the policy experts who are with ActionAid and who are with the academia together looked at what is happening in those countries, which are the best practices across these countries, because these were also chosen through a set of indicators of progressiveness, and what can therefore be brought as lessons learned, and therefore propositions going ahead. Some of these, of course, were taken in the amended social security codes by the Parliamentary Standing Committee. many were not taken, but it's an ongoing effort, and that therefore requires tenacity, that therefore requires communication skills. I know there's a next session on that. That therefore requires research and data analysis skills. That therefore requires skills in those, that in this whole process of doing so, agenda setting and all, as far as skill sets of public policy personnel go. So that's another arena that I think I want to say, the policy formulation. Then there is, of course, the emerging arena, policy adoption. And how do you ensure what's framed eventually gets adopted? And a lot of it has to do with what is called adjusting, compromising, to make it something happen, something good happen, because policy making arena is an arena, as you know, of competing interests. Labor policies, for instance, are competing interests between industries, between the working class, between the welfare state, which sometimes is oriented towards the market and wants to sort of look at figures of growth through capital investments and private growth and market growth. And so therefore, there's a very huge contestational arena. And within that, compromise is to happen. So the question of policy adaptation, adoption, compromising within that contestation area is also an arena of work which is becoming more and more important. Then comes this area of implementation, policy implementation, where I think, honestly, the role of public policy professionals, or what I would say personnel, is less, but should be growing for future. How best to implement? What are the kind of challenges that come during implementation? How to then moderate, modify, change mid-course corrections of that policy? It's an exclusive domain right now of the bureaucracy, which is other public bodies which are to implement these policies. But in future, I see that also as an important area for people who are choosing their vocations, future vocations in public policy. And finally, I also want to say, as Dr. Haran started off, the whole question of evaluation, less focused on, but evaluation of public policies, lessons learned for those policies, creating a feedback loop for future policies, creating a finance feedback loop for future policies. That becomes another important arena of public policies. Colleagues, I will want to stop here, but before I stop, I want to say a few things and open up the discussion. I do think that public policy making is a very, very collaborative arena of work. Very an interesting arena of work with immense learning, with continuous learning, with continuous self-development, learning from people, an arena where you work with a range of stakeholders, and therefore is one of, in my opinion, a very, very interested and committed area of work. And I think a very, very futuristic area of work. I'll stop here and we can encourage interaction, Dr. Arjun. And I request participants here to feel free to ask their questions so we can sort of discuss the way ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for such an insightful and interesting session. Now I would request Dr. Nivedita ma'am to share her views.
Thank you, Mr. Sandeep. Extremely important points you have brought out, and a couple of questions that arise in my mind, if I may share them with you. Let me begin at the end. You talked about the evaluation and impact assessment. Having been a part of the civil service for quite a few years, I have come to the conclusion that as far as the policy making is concerned, we are probably quite well off. Of course, there are lacunae, there is need for mid-course correction, etc. But then that's part of the entire process. But where we really lack is the actual execution and implementation. And the examples you gave are excellent, homeless persons, policy for homeless people, policy, Forest Rights Act, policy for indigenous inhabitants of forest areas. we've got the policies and the acts and the statutes in place, but the execution has been, if I may say, to some extent indifferent. Now, my question would be that having been part of the government, and I can say with total honesty, government very often is not extremely good at doing certain works. We know it. And that is the reason why the non-government, the non-state actors have a very important role to play. And I feel for the purpose of evaluating and ensuring that the execution is happening as it should, I wish and hope that the non-state actors would put much more, probably as much importance to it as they do on the policy formulation. Do you think you would agree with that, Mr. Sandeep?
Thank you, and wonderful to have your experience as a person who's been making policies, Dr. Nivedita Haran. And I think that's important. Firstly, I agree with you that much lesser attention has been given by what you call non-state actors, the civic space per se, particularly in terms of evaluation and impact assessment with reference to public policies, and therefore making that happen. To some extent, in implementation, a lot of social organizations do help in implementation and do work with reference to implementation. But what you mentioned is important. That certainly is an area where much more emphasis is required. And as you rightly said, a lot of emphasis is on public policy making aspect, or that aspect, the development aspect. But there, what I wanted to say, particularly on the last bit I mentioned about public policy making, there's an important lacuna there, ma'am. And that particular lacuna from the civil society as well, as much as from the state itself, is on, although there are processes of public consultation, always, as you said, we have done relatively well. There are always open processes for consultation on any policy and have been so for decades. But the gap there, both from the state side as well as from the non-state actors or civil society side, has been actually consulting the people who are most vulnerable or who are most impacted, or for whom a lot of these policies are made. I gave the example of homeless people, for instance. You mentioned the example of indigenous people and homeless people. Now, a lot of policy agenda setting is on behalf of such people, whether it's by civil society organizations, social academia, or whether it's by the policymakers themselves. So it comes from their wisdom, it comes from their projection of things. So participatory policy making would also mean that those who are really the subjects, quote unquote, or those who are really should be the protagonists of such policy making. And here, for example, we have policies for, let's take an example. We have policies for pastoral people, some kind of ecosystem of policies is there. But I think the future need in that area of work is how are the pastoralists themselves, and among the pastoralists, those who are the most vulnerable, let's say a feminist perspective to policy making, let's say the pastoral woman's perspective to policy making, or let's say within the pastoralists, the small sheep herders view to that policy making. Those are the kind of, these are illustrative gaps that I'm mentioning. So I think there is that emphasis needed as far as agenda setting and policy making is concerned. And that leadership and protagonism, which is what I was trying to sort of highlight in this short presentation. In as much as you mentioned, ma'am, also the need for impact evaluation and evaluation of the impact of those policies. Because in order to develop the second round, or in order to develop further newer policies, that's an important area which is missed out by the civil society, as well as somewhat underemphasized, if I may say, and your experience will be more important in that regard, by the state itself or by the holders of the policy itself. And the third aspect that I will wish to say to your question, ma'am, and leave it there for others, is this whole area of newer arenas of work. Let me take the example of what I started with, the climate impacts. Now, there's a whole range of loss and damage policies, compensation policies, which are needed for future, because people who are at the front lines of let's say, nature, yeah, who are exposed more, are facing that brunt the most, and they have contributed the least to that adverse impact. They have income losses, they have habitat losses, they have other psychosocial losses. Now, I think the newer arenas of work sometimes need protagonism from the civic space or the non-state space to push those agendas. So that's another, this is an example I was giving. So for future, and there's been lots of examples, the right to food policies, for instance, in the past, the information, right to information policies, for instance, in the past. But I think there are newer areas which are coming up. One among them is climate, and the argument that I am making with reference to need for not just resilience building, adaptation, but also the specific need for compensating people who are losing the most in a very focused sense, and for that to carry out assessments, for that to make futuristic policies. So that's another area where I think the role of public policy professionals will only grow. Conflict areas, policies around what do you do in conflict areas, policies around how should we be looking at the question of refugees themselves. So these are areas which typically need, I think, degree of people's protagonism. Whether they are refugees, it's difficult for refugees though, but whether they are the most impacted people. So I think that's an area where the emphasis of the state is relatively slower, and it's for the society, and within the society, those who are at the brunt of it, to push those agendas. So that's how I look at it, but largely agreeing with what you rightly have mentioned, Professor.
Yeah, but if I can just take a
please.
little time. You mentioned the importance of taking the feedback from the protagonists, the actual stakeholders who are getting impacted. I don't know if you're aware of the case which was much reported of a private company setting up windmills in Palghat district, which was sometime in 2000, I think 10, 11, around that time. I happened to be energy as well as revenue secretary at that time. And what came out finally, without going into details, is that the tribal population living there were convinced that this is in their interest, and therefore the land that was assigned to them by the government, by the state, 5 acres of land, they had sold that land to the private parties at a pittance, 200 rupees an acre or something like that. And the windmills were set up, and they were under the impression that they would benefit from it, which was not correct. Now, what I find is that, given this kind of the possibility of people taking advantage of the vulnerable sections, the government, our Tahsildar and the village officer were hopeless. I mean, they did nothing. And of course, they are not the only people. There was a very actively an NGO involved in that. Now, what I feel is that, is it not possible to come up with, especially in these vulnerable areas, come up with some kind of advisory persons who would give them the right kind of advice? You see, given that the temptation of getting that 1,000 rupees or 2,000 rupees, the tribals were actually alienating their land. You may say that it is his decision, but I think it's a wrong decision, and we should advise him and tell him that it should not be done. Now, I find that is a gap that exists. Yeah. And I have seen in some countries abroad, for instance, that there are which have such indigenous population. Of course, many have not handled it very well, but some places, they have this kind of advisory groups who discuss amongst themselves with members of the vulnerable communities, and then they decide, this is our priority, this is what we should do. So that generates awareness, as well as they realize what would be good for them actually in the long run, rather than getting the 2,000 rupees and buying 2 bottles of charayam and then, being homeless for the rest of their lives. Can the NGOs or the non-state actors come up with something like that?
Yes, ma'am. And I think it's a very important point for all the participants, what you just mentioned. See, in situ, when I say in situ, the example you gave was of some communities being misled or thinking not fully through whatever the case may be of what impact it will have. So the importance of social debate and the importance of therefore research is the importance of social conscientization in this case, which may and should involve right-minded, supportive external actors. In this case, the role of public policy professionals becomes vital, objective ones, or rather, let me say, those who are oriented towards the interests of those communities, and therefore, not objective in quote unquote sense becomes vital. Equally well, the need in public policy discourses for setting up the role of ombuds people. Many finance institutions, public finance institutions set up those roles. Equally well, the role of what you mentioned, the social and environmental impact assessments, where there's a whole range of need and role for the public policy professionals becomes very important. You are very right. And we've had this experience in several cases, particularly in mining projects. I myself was once an advisor to IFC MEGA ombudsperson, International Finance Corporation and Multilateral Investment Guarantee Agency. And I have seen how people and there's no one homogeneous community. Within the community as well, within the vulnerable community as well, there are vested interests. So how they can mislead, how a social consensus can be drawn up. So that is a very important arena in context of today's discussions, and an important need as far as public policy personnel are concerned. And that is why the ethical, social, I won't use the term moral, but the ethical and the social orientation and the values, which I think the next session will talk about, more than the skills. For me, what's really important is the ethical and social values of public policy personnel, be it in the civil services, ma'am, as you rightly mentioned, be it in the legislative domain, but more importantly, as we are talking today from a civil society perspective, civil society is also not a monolith. So you may have NGOs with extremely different types of anti-people or anti-poor interests. So that orientation, to me, ma'am, in my and colleagues who are here, in my experience, is the central defining feature, the value systems of public policy personnel. Otherwise, it is like any other techno-managerial art. And I think that is what, from my perspective, which defines and the defining feature between who is a good public policy personnel, thinker, social value person, and who is not. So that is how I will look at it, and you're absolutely right. Otherwise, you will see the kind of results you just mentioned.
Yeah. Thanks, Sandeep. Bhanvi, do you have any questions? Any questions?
Yes, ma'am. Sahil has one question.
Good evening, sir and ma'am. So my question was, what role a public policy person can do in a political party? Like, is there any compartment for a public policy person in a political party?
Oh, yes, of course. Much more and growing. And I think it's a need. Many parties, whether through the party setup itself, or whether through their, let's say, the example of manifesto building. Now elections are coming up. Yeah. So even at the starting phase, let me say. So all political parties have been busy building their people's manifestos, public manifestos, election, what they call election manifestos, be it the state or be it the national or be it the very local. So the role of public policy professionals, and we've seen this in manifesto building itself. Let me take an example. In the towards the 2019 elections, my organization, which is a very grounded organization, the one I work for, in about 200 constituencies, did a simple thing. And what was that simple thing? To consult with most vulnerable communities in about 200 plus constituencies, ask them what are the things they would like to see the elected representatives address should they be elected. And we called it the people's agenda. Yeah. And those were not rhetorical, theoretical people's agendas. Those were actually voices, consultation, and ideas of communities and vulnerable. We focus, of course, on vulnerable communities, and those are contextually specific. What is in Murshidabad is not the same. What is in Latehar is not the same as what is in Kanpur Dehat. So without getting into too much detail on that, that is an arena where public policy professionals, personnel have a huge role to play in building, as Dr. Haran was speaking to, in building that kind of articulation, which is socially conscious, which has a value base to itself, but which definitely supports and advances what people want to see happen. So manifesto building is an important area. Legislators, almost all, and increasingly I see, MPs for sure, we know they have a battalion of colleagues in their teams who are public policy experts, professionals, young professionals, who draft or help draft or refine the policies for themselves. I remember back in 2017, we were making efforts to build a national legislation and pointers for a national legislation. We are NGOs, so we don't build legislations. Yeah. But some ideas for what is needed. Our starting point was what is needed for protection of human rights defenders, social and ecological justice defenders back in the year 2017. And I remember, and we were writing in media articles, people were expressing their needs, given our local work with community-based human rights defenders. And I remember one of the MPs from the then Telangana party, his battalion or his team, 3 of them, approached us to say, we've seen this work, we have seen people doing it. Can you give us ideas? Can you help us draft that? Which was, of course, later introduced by them as a private members bill. And well, the state of private members bill is at least creates a precedence, if nothing else, and a public debate in the parliament. But a private members bill was introduced. It's on the Lok Sabha website. You can go and see it. So there is a whole growing need, I see, of role of public policy professionals within the legislators, parliamentarians, and those who are running for elections within of political parties. Also, political parties on the whole, of course, they have a political orientation, so that is within that space and spirit, but they do need people who can offer ground, data, research, expert, drafting inputs into what would eventually not just become manifestos, but what would become ideas that the parties sort of advance. Let me take a current example. The example is on the current government's idea of what should be uniform civil codes, yeah, and the need for uniform civil codes. That, of course, there is a whole history of different law commissions having taken different views on it, and it's available in research documents, in publications, in websites, and so on and so forth, in actual documents. But the current government wants to introduce a uniform civil code. The uniform civil code will need a clear policy, yeah, and that policy is yet to be constructed. So obviously, the ruling party is at this moment, and the law commission thereof, yeah, is calling for public suggestions and views. At this moment, the date is over now, and therefore propositions for what should be the policy coming up. Now, the party itself the ruling party itself needs a lot of inputs. They will take it from their constituencies. They will take it from people's organizations within their constituencies. They will take it from their own legislators. They will take it from their own policy experts and their own research setups that there are. So there is a whole space there to answer your question in terms of the needs. The opposition's party do the same. Shadow policies are made. So they also need, they have research cells. Each of these parties that we know of, the bigger ones have better ones, stronger ones, they have their own research cells. Now, these research cells, I've interacted with a few in the past 7-10 years. They have a lot of young, upcoming, imaginative, creative, data able to handle data, large data. There are policy teams within those research cells which continuously not just draft, continuously advise the party leaderships on what kind of agendas, what kind of announcements, what kind of policies. Let me take a current example and be short with it. The government of Rajasthan at this moment, in the last few months, of 4 or 5 or 6 months or 1 year, has come out with a range of public policies. One with reference to denotified tribes, another with reference to pensions, and so on and so forth. Another with the question of now they're looking at Dalit policies and policies for Dalit landholding. So they're coming with a range of policies. For that, they're often going out to specialized organizations, to civil society organizations, to organize consultations, to set agendas, to develop policies, to develop programs around the same, to outline the budgets around the same, and also to seek suggestions for how it might be implemented given the electoral needs in a short space of time. So the same thing happened in Karnataka, as you noticed. A range of schemes were announced by the incumbent government as it came out, and all of those were backed and therefore sought inputs from the experts and the role that you mentioned of what could be the quick announcement, what are the financials, what's the back of the envelope calculations, where would the revenues come from, how could the implementation be made, what could be the kind of taglines and headlines which will generate public interest. That was done during the election manifesto building or election announcements, and quickly after the elections that was followed up with a spate of quick policies to do the same. So there is a huge need, in short, let me say that. Any other questions?
Yes,
Friends?
sir, I have a question.
Go ahead,
So,
please.
like we see that in our country, careers in public policy are mushrooming worldwide, and moreover, there are more opportunities that are available in terms of fellowship and all. But the thing is that the youth is getting affected towards the profit-making organizations or the corporates, and public policy is more of a welfare-oriented and a non-profit-making career, I would say. So, how can we draw a balance between a profit-making as well as a non-profit making, and we can encourage our youth, or moreover, the creative minds to get encouraged towards the careers in public policy rather than solely going towards the corporate.
Actually, let me say one thing to begin with, and I mean, largely what you say would be happening and is happening. But I also want to correct a bit of that to tell you that even private companies, and I know a lot of them, even consulting firms, even profit-making entities and corporate entities, law firms, for instance, are hiring and wanting and recruiting people with this set of expertise and knowledge and imagination and creativity, as you spoke about. And they are very, very well-paid jobs as far as those are concerned. So those who are looking for money, those who are looking for quick career growth, there's a whole space there. I'm not talking of academia, but if I now come to academia, if I now come to social formations and social organizations, among which NGOs are one, there are a whole range of others, I think that's where your question is more valid. Those are not immensely paying spaces, immensely economically, let me say, hugely remunerated spaces. But those, what I want to share with colleagues here, in my opinion, of having worked 3 decades in very local social organizations, I worked in Department of Social Work, which is an academic space. I worked in local social organizations, the Jharkhand struggle in those years when the state was not yet born, tribal people's organizations. I work with youth organizations in a large part, and also with international youth organizations, but also with a social organization like ActionAid in these past 3 decades or so. And my experience is that immensely fulfilling. So what's compensated is your social satisfaction, your personal satisfaction. What is compensated for money is space. So you get a range of experience, space, public interaction. So if you're sitting in a corporate, as against if you're sitting in a social organization today, through these 30 years, a lot of my colleagues who are my classmates when I was young in college, and who are big people in corporate ladder, and as compared with me, who's in a social organization in the same 30 years, a lot of them want to come and work with us, leave their jobs. Maybe they've made money, but totally dissatisfied, totally with a feeling that we have worked for somebody else's gains. We have worked and oppressed people, been a chain of that part of oppression. Secondly, there's a whole space question. For social organizations, they're not too hierarchically structured. They're not too constrained. So any young person who's working in social organizations has immense opportunities for public roles, public spaces, public interactions. Civil servants also have that, by the way. Yeah. So immense possibilities of self-growth, thinking, knowledge expansion, and the way you see the world and the way you become in that world, and not just pertaining to the national sphere. In a social organization, I've had opportunities through this very grounded work to learn from other countries, to work in other countries, to expand my worldview, so that you don't get in a very corporate hierarchy jobs. You may travel to those countries, but you don't get to engage with the people who make that country, the majorities of the country. There's a class question there as well. You interact with particular classes. Immensely fulfilling, immensely self-growing, immensely also helping you recognize who you are in the end. So I think there's a philosophical aspect to this whole story as well. And finally, what should therefore be done? I think what is called social spaces, particularly social organizations, because of their capacities and constraints, financial capacities and constraints, and also space constraints, are not being able to attract too many younger people to their spaces, those who are looking for much better economic futures in a computational world. And I think a lot more effort is also due on part of social organizations to be able to share with the world of what's the kind of social value, what's the kind of self-value, self-growth value that people get in this kind of work. That has been a limitation of the civil organizations and that's the biggest limitation for them to be able to not attract people in these days. And that's a gap. I kind of want to say that, and I think that needs addressing. And finally, I think it also needs the states internationally in different countries, the welfare states, to sort of look at this story, because eventually, in the long run, this will create lacuna and challenges for the states themselves. And therefore, this whole question of restricting spaces for civil society is one of the factors which acts as a deterrent for young people to be pursuing those paths in the public policy field as well. Yeah?
Yes, sir. So there is one more question from Vishesh.
I can't see it. If you can tell me, ma'am.
Hello. Yeah. Hi, sir. Can you hear me?
Vashisht, I can hear you.
Yeah. So my question is from the last point that you highlighted. That is the central thing for a public policy professional is sort of having the sensibility of justice, equity, fairness. So I understand the that orientation for vulnerable sections and the marginalized sections. But at the same time, how do we also develop this sense towards economic growth, economic development? I mean, balancing this, sort of not trading off development, economic growth by affecting marginalized sections, by affecting the environment, by pushing the ecology. What would be
First,
the spaces to enter,
I
I mean,
think
thinking in this direction?
Vashishji,
Yes, sir.
no, thanks. It's a very, very important question. And I don't think it's a binary. I don't think it's an oppositional question. Uh, that is why this argument of what's called people-led inclusive growth, but also not growth for growth's sake. You can have exploitative growth, you can have accumulation growth, which is what largely creates greater inequality and distress, and which is where probably your question comes from. But as several economic experiments tell us, and several philosophies tell us, several trajectories tell us, people-led economic growth, inclusive economic growth, you may use whatever jargon, solidarity economic growth is possible, is a necessity given all the crises we are facing, including ecological crisis, and is a historical compulsion. It's a deeper debate we can have, but what I want to say is following the kind of growth models, or following the kind of sort of developmental models which the global north has had done in the past, which was based on intense accumulation from the colonized countries, is a historic impossibility for the global south, countries like ours, and an ecological dead end as well. Yeah. But in order to do so, I think a lot of work is happening in the arena of how to create collective economies, how to create cooperatives, collectives, farmers, producers, for instance, how to make workers owners of the enterprises. So different ways of solidarity economy are possible, which overcome the kind of binary that there is, that if there is growth, then there has to be trade-off between what is growth and what is people's needs. I don't think it needs to be that way for future, and that is the path that is an important arena for practitioners and public policy people to actually work on a kind of growth which may not be extreme growth, a kind of growth which takes into account and considers everyone together, it leaves no one behind, which creates a solidarity future, which creates an equal future, or a more equal future, a just future, which creates a future in togetherness, in balance with the nature. Now, these are not just theories or rhetoric that I'm talking of. This is a need, a compulsion, if I may call it. And this is the kind of, there are several ways in which to do it. And I think that's an arena which it needs to be there. So it need not always be seen, or should be seen, or should be posited, or should be, sort of modeled in a trade-off manner. For instance, years back, the tribal people in Odisha, the Khons of different groups, were being evacuated and expelled from their own homelands for an alumina plant, a processing plant. What Dr. Haran was mentioning in the beginning, they didn't even believe that this kind of setting up of factories by a private corporation would benefit them. But nevertheless, they were being forced to give up their area, their prayer forests, their homeland, in the name of such development. So I think that is where the trade-off issues come from. What will eventually create benefit? Will they get jobs? How long will be those jobs? Or will there be manual labor in those factories? Or what percentage of them would be manual labor in those factories? Now, that kind of growth models are possibly not desirable. And when you see that, that kind of economic development models are possibly not the way forward collectively as a country. And therefore, different ways will need to be explored. I'm aware I'm overrunning time, but I think that's the direction of what I'm thinking. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, sir.
Thanks, Mr. Sandeep. It was an excellent discussion. And a lot of good points have come out.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you for your questions as well as for your moderation and sharing. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Arjun.
Thank you, sir,
I'll
for
hand it over.
enlightening us with your mind-boggling thoughts. And Team IMPRI is fortunate to have you, and we look forward to have you for more future events as well. Thank you, sir. So moving forward, I would like to call Mr. Yash Agarwal for for sharing his session on the skills in career in public policy part 2. Over to you. Over to you, Yash.
Hi team, I hope I'm clearly audible, visible. Thank you so much for having me. I'll keep it quick because I know that we have very little time and close the day. Maybe I'll just quickly share my screen. I have a short deck to share today. Please do let me know if this is visible.
Yes.
Yes, awesome. Perfect. Thank you so much. What I plan on covering today is just two things. 5 principles, right from here, not all 10, 5 which I think are the most relevant for anyone looking to build a career in the public policy space in India, right? And secondly, like a very simple 3-track process in terms of how you can operationalize this, right? Like make this a reality. And in between, I'll just be very happy to walk you through how my career journey has played out, right? Like I've never studied policy. I don't even have a master's, right? I just have a BA in journalism. So from there, going to the parliament, working at Twitter, running my own consulting firm, like how has that played out, right? And what has actually helped me do whatever it is that I've done, right? So without any further ado, okay, 10 principles for building a meaningful career in the 2020s. Okay, why are we discussing this, right? So see, everyone here will have very unique journeys in the policy space, right? And that's very obvious because of just how new this field is, right? The rules of the road are still being written. This is in particular how I like to put it. But there are some principles which for sure will help you, just do meaningful work here, right? And really help you get a better sense of how you should think about your career journey in this space, right? These are not specifics, just broad-based principle level things, right? We'll cover these, so please don't worry. Let's delve right in. First of all, what is policy and how this is structured in India? Okay, we covered this in the session day before yesterday, right? ED needs, spaces, functions, verticals, right? And proof of work or proof of education. So I won't repeat that. Skills, right? The first principle. You can look at the tweet there, right? That one day the only jobs people will do will be jobs only people can do, right? Essentially means that anything that is maybe repetitive or that is highly say technical, right? Or something that can be scaled up, right? Can and will be automated, right? In fact, things that don't even fit this criteria being automated, right? I mean, ChatGPT, right? Who knew that something as creative as writing, right? To a certain extent is something that, we could rely on machines for, right? So every single trade, every single job, right? Every single occupation these days is increasingly becoming about soft skills. It's increasingly becoming about the human elements of the job, right? There's a reason why we are happy to pay more for our organic food, right? Because there's a higher human involvement in it, or for handcrafted arts or furniture or something, right? Because again, it's not made by machines; it's human involvement, right? You'll see it all across in all phases of the world, right? So every single job, there's a far higher value placed in terms of the human element of the job itself, right? And so that boils down to your skills as well, right? So things like, communication, right? How do you present yourself? Critical thinking, right? How do you manage stakeholders, right? Empathy, right? So empathetic listening and all of that, right? That is the most important skill to have these days. I can assure you hard skills like, coding or website design or whatever, right? It's stuff that you can actually learn fairly easily. Okay. That's really not a constraint anymore, especially given, the amount of resources out there and how accessible some of these have become, right? It's the soft skills, it's the softer elements of the job that you're doing. It's a human element that really is, far more critical than we think of it to be. So these are the skills that matter, right? Sample it out. This is especially for those working in policy, right? So basically, The point here being that, see, everything under the sun has a huge public policy element, right? From gender to healthcare, education, climate change, environment, whatever, right? All of it. Now, in my understanding of it, it's very difficult to understand, to figure out for yourself what is it that you really like to work on, right? And equally important to figure out what is it that you don't like to work on as well, right? See, if you love something, in terms of the field that you're working on, that is your biggest competitive advantage. Okay. Uh, that is where, no one else can beat you at the job if you love the job that you're doing. And especially when it comes to policy, right? If it's a field that you care about, right? Nothing like it. So it can be education, it can be healthcare, it can be gender, it can be sustainability, climate change, whatever, right? But if it's a field or a cause that you're passionate about, right? That will really make a steep difference in terms of how well you do the job and what kind of a career you build, right? So the point being that, sample it out, try out different fields, right? Like when I was in college, right? I remember this was a 3-year degree, right? It was a BA in journalism. In 3 years, so within 6 semesters, I did almost like 8 internships, full-time internships, right? We used to have a semester break for 1 or 2 months, and each in different city and different focus area, different sector, right? So one with Government of India, one with Ministry of Health, one was Teach for India, one with Member of Parliament, etc. Right? And so by the time I graduated, right, this is in 2019, I was 20 years old, and I had already, tried out all different fields within policy, right? Gender, healthcare, education, climate change, all of it, right? And then I could really make a tech policy, right? And so I could really make a sense that, what, tech policy is something I love, right? And that's something I want to build a career in, right? No amount of Googling or reading will teach you this, nothing, right? Only practical exposure will. But please sample it out in that sense. Right? Show and don't tell. Just building on, the previous point I was making, which is, see, this is still a fairly new field in India, public policy, right? It's up and coming in that sense, right? And so if you want to build a career here, work gets you work, okay? Which means people care a lot more about the work you've done more than the degree you have, right? I could honestly build the career that I have only because if, all the internships and work that I had done during college, right? I remember when I was applying for my job at Twitter, right? I knew of people who have done an MPP, right, from Harvard, who had also applied, right? And so I was like, there's no way I'm going to get it, right? After, 8 interviews in 2 months, I got it. And then, within 7 months, which is a record time for a company like this, I got a promotion. And I asked my manager then why, right? Because there was definitely technically someone, better suited for the role. And I got a very simple response. And this is something I've seen all across, the past 5 years of working here, which is, we could see the work you've done, Yash, at, PPI, Public Policy India. This is a platform that I have, right? We could see that you're doing content as well, marketing as well, design as well, sales as well, right? And we could see that you have done so many internships in so many different cities and sectors, right? And literally by the time you're like 21 or 22, you have done all of this, right? The point being, as long as you have work to show, right, that matters a lot more than, anything on your resume in that sense, right? Like, so for example, instead of telling someone that I know policy research, send them a policy research paper you've written, right? That will matter a lot more, right? Have a portfolio of the work you've done, right? Maybe have a personal website. It's free to build, right? You have no idea the amount of work opportunity that comes my way because of the number of people who go to yashagarwal.co, sorry, right? Again, show and don't tell, right? So proof of work over proof of, education and whatever, like practical exposure and experience is what people really care about when they're making choices and judgments about you as a candidate and looking to hire you. Spread the word. Just building on what I was mentioning earlier, right? So the idea here is that, you can literally become luckier. Okay, so read the tweet, right? Luck surface area. It's a very popular concept, right? You can Google it. There's a lot more to read on this. Basically, the idea is make it easy for others to help you. Every single job that I've done in my life, right? It has been because some stranger on the internet sent me a link thinking that Yash might be interested in this, right? Basically, it's important to do good work, but it's equally important to, don't fret from talking about it either. And when I say that, I mean, it does not mean bragging at all, right? The point is talk about your challenges, right? Talk about if you need any support, right? Talk about if you want someone to partner with you on something you might be working on, right? But at least be in a sense of connect and contact, right? Share your experiences, right? You have no idea the amount of opportunities that come your way just because, people are aware of what you're working on, and, where and how they can support you. People are genuinely happy to help, right? So as long as you allow them to do that, there's nothing wrong, right? So spread the word, right? So again, personal website, very important, right? It's for free, right? You can learn on YouTube how to build it. Portfolio of your work, right? Write some articles, some publications, some Canva, whatever it is, right? Videos, anything else. Put it together in a place and host it on somewhere, right? Make sure your LinkedIn is well done, right? Stuff like that. Right? It all matters, right? Again, the software aspects of the job. Shun the competition. The final career principle that I want to cover, which is basically, see, the moment there's a job opening in India, or even an internship opening, right? Some, I don't know, 5 crore people apply. There's nothing you can do, right? It gets lost in the race, right? So my request to you will be that you should also, create opportunities for yourself. Don't just rely on opportunity that exists already, right? So every single internship that I did in college, every single, all 7, 8 of them, none of them were openings. None of them were internship openings, right? All of these opportunities I created for myself by either cold emailing, DMing on LinkedIn, asking my professor if they know they have a contact somewhere, asking my previous place of work if they can recommend somewhere else, etc., right? Tap into your networks. People are genuinely happy to help. Reach out, right? But again, do what we discussed in the previous slide first, which is make your portfolio of your work, personal website, LinkedIn, and all, and then reach out. Make it easier for others to help you, right? And then do reach out, right? Create opportunities for yourself. And even when you're cold emailing or DMing, you can't just be like, hey, can you give me a job? It doesn't work that way, right? You always have to be like, something like, hey, I've been following the work here that you've been doing, right? Really appreciate it. These are my skills. Let me know if I can add value, right? Let me know if you can collaborate, right? The idea is to always show how can you add value to their life. Only then they will reply, right? Because these are busy people, right? Mostly senior people that you're reaching out to, right? So please be mindful of all of this. Email IDs of all of these individuals. YouTube is a far better teacher than me to teach you how to write these emails, how to find out these email IDs. So I won't waste time on that, right? So again, shun the competition. Final bit that I want to add, right, before I take up questions, also that, see, ultimately it all boils down to credentials, right? If you want to land a job here or internship, anything, credentials, right? It all boils down to that, not just in policy, anywhere. So there's a very simple 3-step process to that, okay? A lot of that overlaps with what we've discussed already, but I feel it is important to give you this framework. First is become aware of what the credentials in your field are, right? For example, if you're an engineer, then hosting the code that you've written on GitHub is a credential, right? It's a very cool thing, and it's something people consider highly credible, right? In policy, it can be like maybe interning at places with decent brand recognition, right? Or working on some sort of a project like that or something or whatever, right? So basically figure out what the credentials in your field are, right? Second step, present your existing credentials better, okay? Which means what we just discussed, so like, make sure that your resume is well done. It conveys what you worked on very efficiently. Same about your LinkedIn, right? Make sure that you have that website for yourself, a portfolio of your work, presenting your existing credentials better, right? In those spaces and platforms, please tell people that these are my areas of interest. Here's how you can get in touch. I would be happy to collaborate. Stuff like that, basic stuff, right? And third is create new credentials for yourself, right? So again, the course that you're attending at IMPRI right now, that is you creating new credentials for yourself, right? That, hey, I attended this training program on 5 years and you get a certificate or something, whatever, right? It can be interning somewhere. It can be volunteering somewhere part-time, right? It can be taking up some project-based work. It can be consulting somewhere. Anything and everything, right? Create those credentials as well, right? So 3-step process again, right? To land a job and build a career. Becoming aware of what the credentials that matter are, presenting your existing credentials better, and third is creating new credentials for yourself. I really hope this gives you like, very structured sort of an understanding of how the broader career skills and, space and policy is operating right now. I will stop sharing and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Yash. Nivedita ma'am, if you would like to add something to this.
It was brilliant, Yash Agarwal. I think you really brought it down to brass tacks, and I was listening to it, and I found that that's exactly what I think the participants would have liked to hear. And excellent, giving your personal examples. I really like that. But I would make a request, when you put these things in, bring in a bit of mention of maybe the value systems, how they also need to make sure that they have the fundamental values correct, which I think in our country we are kind of lacking in a way now. And that is something we should build on over the next few years if we are to become a superpower in the near future. Our youngsters have to realize and understand that certain values are non-negotiable. And those values should be inculcated in them. Hopefully, they have got something built in them from their homes, from the schools and colleges. But just to reinforce that, I think that aspect also would be very nice. But
Totally agree.
it was brilliant. I enjoyed it. Thank you. Any
Thank you, ma'am.
questions?
Participants can ask their questions while raising their hands or typing in the chat.
Okay.
Hello, sir.
Yes.
So which fellowships you can suggest for public policy?
If you go to publicpolicy.com, we have a list of 180 fellowships that you can take up. I would suggest any that you can get into, honestly, because it all will teach you something. It will all count, right? Some fellowships, like say LAM, Gandhi Fellowship, Teach for India, they are older, more established and better structured. But we do see a lot of new fellowships coming up all the time, right? I think this year, if I'm not this year, I think this year they launched the Mukherjee Fellowship, right, which is on again working in the parliament. Just last week, they launched a fellowship wherein you can work at the intersection of AI and policy. So again, new things coming up all the time, right? This caused by IMPRI, right? I think what Dr. Arjun can correct me, right? It's 2 or 3 years old, right? Maybe not that old, right? These are the initiatives that we have. So again, very valuable additions, right? Although technically not a fellowship, right? So the point being, be open to new initiatives that are coming up, right? But honestly, anything will be a value add. So yeah.
Right. If no one has, we can wait for more questions. But let me take this opportunity and I second Nivedita ma'am. Fabulous with the energy. Yeah, she's propagating this very nice. I concern that a lot of people get weird out or tired doing that. So what are your suggestions for motivation while doing this? Because there is a like you got 7-8 internship, you had a good success rate, but a lot of people face a lot of difficulties and failures. So how to keep up that momentum in your views? Yes.
Sorry, that's a very important question, Arjun. Couple of things, right? So one is what someone just asked. I feel fellowships are a phenomenal way, again, to build a career, because technically fellowships are a mix of education and working, right? So get a bit of both. Second thing I would say is that take up more programs like the one you're attending right now. Okay. So I think next month onwards, IMPRI is doing like a 1 month long sort of a thing, right? Where it's not just about careers, but more about the policy space. And other than IMPRI, a lot of platforms, very reputed platforms, which, do extend such courses and programs where you can learn more and meet like-minded people, right? That's a very good way to go about it as well, because, and I need to highlight this here, the value of such programs is not just the learning that you get. The value of such programs is meeting a like-minded community of individuals who, are on a similar journey as you, right? Where you can exchange emails, get to learn from their journey, ask questions, meet experts, keep in touch with them, etc. Right? So something like that also really helps. And the final thing I'll also add is that be shameless in asking for help. Okay. At maximum, someone will not reply to your email. That's it. It's fine. You're a student, you're asking for help, for an opportunity to intern, to work, to volunteer. Ultimately asking for an opportunity if there's a way you can add value. So do not think too much. What will they think of me 5 years from now? 5 years from now, no one will remember. Trust me, right? So please reach out. Please ask for help. Do it in a very polite manner and make it easy for others to help you, right? So make sure your other work portfolio and all this order in order. But yeah, this space makes it very difficult for you to get a foot in the door. But once you do get a foot in the door, it's really a wonderful place to travel. So I hope that answers.
Right. Great. So if anyone have any further question, Tanvi, do you have any? Now is the time to ask that. Vasishji, yeah.
Yeah, hi Yash, that was a great session. So yesterday only we had a session on AI. So according to you, I mean, what would you feel, especially in the policy space, which would be sort of taken over by machines, and sort of which skills would we need to build as policy professionals to be future ready and to be more relevant in our contribution to policy making?
So there are two parts to the question, Ashish, right? So I think on the first one, in terms of how AI, will impact like the whole policy and careers bit. I don't speak on things I don't know very well about, so I won't speak on that. There are people working on AI in particular, maybe they can take that up. But on the bit of around skills, right? Honestly, the first slide itself that we discussed today, right, which is soft skills, human elements of any and every job, right? So as long as you're good at communications, at writing, right, at managing stakeholders, right, as long as you're a good critical thinker, right, you can do 2 + 2 together. It should be fine. And actually, thank you for asking that, because there's one thing that I forgot to cover, which is, please remember that public policy is about knowing 10% of 100% of the issues out there, instead of knowing 100% about 10% of the issues. I'll repeat, right? So policy today is about knowing 10% of 100% of the issues and subjects out there, right? Instead of knowing 100% about just 10% of the subjects. Breadth over depth, especially for early part of your career, right? So it is literally your job to read newspapers or basically be well informed. It can be anywhere, that's fine, right? But to read and learn, only then you can do 2 + 2 together as policy professionals, because in public policy, everything is intersectional, right? So, for example, you never work only in gender alone. You work at the intersection of gender and health, or gender and education, right? Whatever, right? So a lot of things are cross-functional and intersectional, so you need to know a bit about a lot of other fields apart from strictly the one that you might be focusing on. Yeah.
Also, I have a question. Like you mentioned, that soft skills are more important for career in public policy. So there are people who are good at hard skills, and some people are good at soft skills. So how can people enhance their soft skills, as well as I believe that those skills are equally important for getting success rate in a public policy, rather than just focusing on the soft skills.
Absolutely, Bhanvi. In fact, there's no doubts about it, right? There's no substitute for either. My point was that hard skills are relatively simpler to learn these days. Either you know coding or you don't, right? When it comes to communication, it's a knob, it's not a switch, right? There's a spectrum, right? But coming to the first part of what you asked, you can only get better at these things by doing them more often. As simple as that, right? So be it writing, be it communicating, something as simple as how do you write an email, right? Stakeholder management, you only get better at these things by doing them more often. That is it, right? Reading won't teach you these things. Watching a video on YouTube won't teach you these things, right? Just practice, right? So I remember what I used to do in college was I had a blog when I would write articles, but I would go back and read those articles a month after I had written them, right? So that, I could just take an impartial view at the thing that I had written myself, right? And this was like a private blog, no one knew of it, right? And every time I would be like, wow, what shit do I write, right? It's not good at all, but that's fine, right? It gave me a perspective of how do I improve, right? And within a month, I would, really grow a lot in that sense. So do it more often. Read in a private space, just reach out to people by emails, practice it. It's fine. No one will penalize you.
So if anyone has any more questions.
Great. We can move to next session for the concluding remarks by Dr. Nivedita, ma'am.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes. Oh, yes. If you want to add anything, you can.
Anything more, Yash? You can.
No, not at all. I was just drop my, LinkedIn here. Everyone who's attending the session, please feel free to reach out. I'm always happy to talk about it. Thank you very much.
Great.
Thank you, Yash. May I come in, Dr. Arjun?
Yes, ma'am. Please.
Okay. So I think the participants of the program have had 3 days of extremely immersive, varied collection of presentations and idea sharing. And I think perhaps most of the aspects of public policy making, career in public policy, the pitfalls, they have been covered. We had Dr. Mukul the first day. He gave some very good examples and explained how what is it that we need to do now in order to ensure that the public policy, those who are seeking careers in public policy, actually are doing it in a manner which would be helpful for the country, which would ensure that they are looking at things in a manner which would which would take the country forward. We also had some very interesting presentation yesterday with the AI and the new tools that were presented by the expert. I think that really was a kind of eye-opener for, I'm sure, most of you. All of you know that social media and AI tools are extremely important and omnipresent these days. But how much is it going to impact your lives? I think it's mind-boggling. Persons like you who are seeking careers, maybe in public service, maybe elsewhere, you just cannot bypass these tools now. So you need to be aware of them, you need to be adept at them. And Yash just now explained how spread your knowledge, spread your the desire to learn more rather than specializing from a very young age. I think that's a very good advice. You need to have an open mind. You need to look at things from from different perspectives, from different people's perspectives. I think that is something that is that's extremely important. Yesterday, Urvashi gave you some ideas about what are the openings in the government, what is it that Niti Aayog does, the fact that Niti Aayog is contemplating opening of kind of mirror images or clones of Niti Aayog in every state. I think that should be an extremely good opening for many of you. She also talked about the need for having experiential knowledge rather than just bookish knowledge. I think that's again very important for people who are not just in the government, even in the non-state sector. What was explained a little while back by Mr. Sandeep. In fact, times have come now where probably there'll be many more openings in the non-state sectors than in the state sectors. That's what I anticipate. So all this must have put a lot of ideas into your head. And I want to put them all together and share a few of my ideas very briefly, very quickly. And those could probably set you thinking, and you could, as you go ahead with your education, with your vocational training, you could come back and read some of them and think about some of them. In this regard, before I forget, and Bhanvi, maybe you can take note of that, some good books were mentioned during the course of some of the talks. And I think those are extremely recommendable to the participants. I think one of them was Karl Popper's Open Society and Its Enemies. Some writings of Swami Vivekananda. I think that is again very important because, I think as time passes, the getting that out, the Indianness is going to become very, very important. From my side, I would recommend read Tagore. Tagore's Religion of Man is very important, especially in our society where a lot of divisions arise. Tagore is one of the best writers in that. Even in novels, Tagore's Gora was ahead of his times. His novel Gora talks about things that even today, we feel that, did he write that 100 years ago? It's unbelievable. So these are some of the books I thought I will mention to you. Now, after having listened to these talks, some of the takeaways that I would like to leave you with are as follows. I can anticipate, and I can anticipate with reasonable certainty, that in the next few decades, let's say the next 2 or 3 decades, there will be an extremely high demand of people with the kind of knowledge that we have discussed over the last 3 days. People who are aware of how projects happen, how policies happen, the tools that are needed to make these policies, which are the tools that would make decision-making more balanced, quicker, faster. I think these are things that are going to be extremely important for all youngsters in the coming few decades. But what is also going to be very important, let's not forget, is a perceptive mind. A mind that is expansive, reads, knows, and not just the bookish knowledge or knowledge picked up from Google, but knowledge that they have got through experience. So my advice to youngsters always is, look at things as you go by. As you walk on the road or drive on the road or cycle on the road, look at both sides and see what's happening. Is there garbage lying around? Are there homeless people there? You know, you need to be aware of what's happening in the country, whether it's in the urban centers, rural centers, everywhere. Keep your ears and eyes open. That's very important. Be perceptive. The second thing that's very important is be committed. When you're doing something, when you're putting your mind to something, put your heart and soul into it. Make sure that you're putting in not just 10%, 50%. Put in 110%. Put in more than you could imagine you could ever do. That is very important. I think that sometimes we miss out on, and therefore we probably feel that we are being left out. And some very good advice that Yash gave just now was I think you should take that to mind. Reach out. Try to reach out to people and find out where is it that you could fit in. That's extremely important. Then, of course, and I add to that, be straightforward, be honest, and be smart. Don't take any flack from anyone, but at the same time, don't try to bluff people. That doesn't get you anywhere. I'm sure all of you who are attending this course are doing so because you believe in the development of the country. You believe that our country can move ahead. You believe that there is a narrative which is possible to be achieved, which says that by 2047, we could actually be a developed country. I frankly feel that we can, but there is a lot of things that you need to do, we need to do together. And if you are such a person, you also need to be sure that, and I repeat that word again, and I was so happy that it was there in Yash's presentation, you need to be empathetic. You need to understand people from their perspective. You know, very often people working in the area of public service or public policy making get carried away or get proved wrong because they are not empathetic. You need to understand a problem by putting yourself in that person's position, that person's shoes. Only then you will be able to understand that problem properly. Therefore, cultivate that habit of being empathetic. And it's not very difficult, trust me. If you start doing it, you will find that it's actually quite fun when you try to understand something from the perspective of the person who's selling fruits on the roadside, or the bus conductor, or even your class teacher or your professor. It's a quality that needs to be cultivated. Then, of course, you need to have a strong and a mind that seeks justice. Justice is extremely important, and especially when we talk of public service and public service that is executable, that is being executed or has been executed. You have to be just. No law can be unjust. And it's also important that given the fact that any law is a written down law, it's always in a language. And as you know, language can always be misinterpreted. And language can always have problems of discretionary power, for instance. Make sure that whenever you're interpreting a law or reading a law, and where you find that there is a discretionary aspect to it, use your discretion in favor of the more vulnerable. That is very important. And I think that is what Gandhiji had said in his talisman. That I think that is something that has to be there in our country if our country has to move forward. I also want to emphasize on the fact that it's not enough to have the country gaining in GDP, in having wonderful infrastructure, socio-economic infrastructure, as well as other physical infrastructure. It's also necessary that there is reduction in inequality. And sometimes I fear, and I especially saw that during the Corona period, and I think some of you would have seen that if you are perceptive enough. It created a new kind of inequality, which I call the digital inequality. There were children who could not go to school and they were attending classes. No child could go to school, actually. No teacher could go to school either. So classes were being conducted online. People who had smartphones, who had laptops at home could do so. But there were people who did not have. So then that came to my mind, and what we did immediately, and I suggested to a few people here where I live, and we quickly set up an area where we set up 10 laptops, and we asked the kids that whoever wants to attend classes should book the time, and they can use those laptops to attend the digital classes. I think we need to improvise. We need to be inventive and innovative in solving our problems. And only then we would be able to reduce inequality. Make sure there is the technology that you all are enjoying, that we all are enjoying, is accessible to everyone. It's only then that we'll be able to say that our country has really been able to move forward. Otherwise, we are creating a society where, again, there'll be divisions. There'll be divisions of the haves, the digital haves, and the digital have-nots. We don't want such a society. We want the entire country to move forward, and that's extremely important. I think, finally, I want to mention that anyone in the public service has to make sure that, first, they are strong on technology. Second, they are aware of the environmental issues, of the issues of climate change, of ecology, etc. Third, they also have very solid knowledge and domain knowledge in the areas that they profess to have studied. And fourth, they need to be persons who are able to engage with the non-state actors also. You cannot keep yourself limited just to the government or to the public servants. You need to make sure that you are also aware of and in contact with persons who are working in the policy sector, in the non-state arena. And that is extremely important, because only when these happen, these four characteristics are taken together and they are synergized, will we be able to make sure that the impact of a policy reaches the people who it is meant for. I have a lot of, as I speak to you, I have a lot of examples that come to my mind, but I don't think we have too much time. But what I would like you to do is learn from examples, reach out to people, and do not let other people, browbeat you and tell you that, no, you cannot do it. There's nothing that you cannot do. And especially in modern times where you have so much availability of technological tools, anyone can do anything, provided you put your heart and soul into it. I think I will stop here. It was a pleasure being here for 3 days and interacting with many of you and listening to the very erudite presentations that were made over the last 3 days. I gained a lot, I learned, and I'm sure you guys also would have learned a lot. So thanks to all of you. Thanks to Bhanvi. Thanks to Dr. Arjun. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. I would say we were fortunate to have you with us for the past 3 days. And with your permission, I would like to add just a small example that I personally felt with terms of empathy. Like daily, I go to some place, so I meet a cobbler daily. So he used to like there was an eye contact between me and him, so I just gave him a small smile. And next day also same thing happened. I just gave him a smile. And then it happened for continuously 1 week, and then I went to him and asked कि भैया like why do you get so much happy and elated to see me? So he said कि यहाँ पे लोग बहुत आते हैं but कभी भी मुझे कोई notice नहीं करता, but आपने मुझे smile दिया तो मुझे ये लगा कि हाँ मैं किसी के लिए important हूँ. So from that day, I realized that these small people, or we can say that these people who are just, I can say, are getting neglected, they needs to be getting uplifted, because these people do have their hearts, and these people do want to share their voices. And then that day, I just sat with him and discussed like, "आप कहाँ से आए हैं? What is your all background?" And there was, I would say that there was a very practical learning experience for myself. So yes, empathy plays a very important role, more than the practical knowledge, I would say, and the bookish language.
Yeah, excellent, Bhanvi. So it's such a touching example. And next time when you do that, make sure you also ask the people whether he has a bank account, paisa kahan rakhte hain, does he have a Jan Dhan account? And when the government again opens the Jan Dhan counters, it's closed now. They will be starting it in the near future. Get the Jan Dhan accounts open for them. You know what is a Jan Dhan account?
Yes, ma'am. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So that's what all of you should do. That's what, when the Jan Dhan account was on, you won't believe how many hundreds I have got Jan Dhan accounts open around me, until the Ministry of Finance Joint Secretary called me and said that, "Madam, how are you getting all these people?" I said that, yeah, because I talk to everyone and tell them, any worker I see, construction worker or my fruit seller or my laundry man, anyone I see, I say, open a Jan Dhan account, because it's meant for them. That's another problem that we have in our country, which is a lot of the benefits that are meant for the people do not reach those people. And I was giving an example. I don't know if I was doing it here or elsewhere, I forget. But, every year when the rains happen, what is it called? The disaster time. There is something called disaster ex gratia that is paid by the government. Every state gives that. And it is given to the people who are who are economically weaker, so that it's given in the form of dry ration from the ration shop. They get 5 kilos of rice every week, and etc. etc. Now, the public affairs of the public, it's called the consumer affairs officer, has to make a list of these people. And you won't believe it. In Kerala, we used to do it very nicely, very perfectly, because we had computerized the list. I checked up here I'm living now in NCR, and UP is very close to me, and I checked up. And they said, list banate hain. So I said, show me the list once. I went to a village and asked. And the list, the first name on the list was the name of the Panchayat president, the Sarpanch. He was number 1. I don't think he's economically challenged. The second name was of the school principal. You see, that's how the government policies are put to naught, because people do not know how to demand. And you guys are supposed to be their eyes and ears, and you should guide them. You should handhold them. Only then our country will be able to reduce inequality. It will not come otherwise. Dr. Arjun, do you agree with me?
Yes, ma'am, totally. Yes.
I think these are the youngsters who should be doing it. And if they do it, why is it that in Kerala, you cannot cheat people in this manner? Jab wahan pe list banayenge, that list will have to be put up in the Panchayat office on the notice board. Yahan pe kuch bhi nahi lagaya. I said, where is the list? Why is it not transparent? They looked at me very blankly and said that, as if I'm asking something out of the moon. So you see, people are not demanding. Learn to demand. That is the way that we will be able to make our policies more, more efficacious, rather than just having it as a law or in paper.
Exactly.
Yeah, over to you, Bhanvi.
So, ma'am, my next mission would be to spread awareness.
Yes, please do that. And you have me.
Aware and empower. Yes.
Absolutely. So what did you think of the entire session? Dr. Arjun, let's have your feedback. You were a silent listener.
No, to organize it requires a lot of.
Yeah, I know that.
I,
No,
I,
I mean,
really, I really liked it, the way I contemplated that this is very important. Especially, I thought of you to chair these sessions so that we have all kinds of voices in, be it corporate or be it government or academicians or also Yash, so that we have something for all of us to learn from. And we got very good questions, so I'm very glad for that. We almost whatever things I was hoping that someone will touch. So those all came in, and Sandeep sir, Mukul sir, Urvashi ma'am, Yash, Amit sir, they were all so kind. So to give this much of insight and prepare, especially this is very non-official topic for anyone, careers and telling these things. So we're really very thankful to them and you for curating this with us.
yeah, why don't we listen to one of the participants if there is 2 minutes time?
Of course. If
Uh,
any participant
if
would
they
like
have
to-
anything to say. Banvi, can we, with your permission?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
If any participants would like to share anything.
Their feedback?
You can raise hand or type. Mansi, Priyanka, Astha, would you like to add anything? Sahil ji, Vashish ji.
I think let me be more direct. Were you happy with the sessions?
Ma'am, there is one feedback from the Sushti. He said that it was very inspiring closing remarks from you, and truly career in public policy is just a small part within much larger, broader and virtuous sense.
Well said.
Yes, Astha, go ahead.
So for me, public policy initially was something that was inapproachable, something that was too high for me to achieve. But after listening to all the 3 days, the sessions, it now looks achievable. It also looks something that is not so bureaucratic as I assumed it was, or what I heard it was, because I'm just a BA student, so I've not had that exposure yet, and I'm an intern at IMPRI, and I just joined 2 months ago. So I'm like building connections, building my knowledge base and everything. So it now looks approachable, I feel, and it's all because of the sessions and the variety of speakers that we've had. Yeah, it's very exciting to like look forward to what my interest now grow in this field. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Astha. Anyone else?
Ma'am, with your permission, I would also like to add on to this. Like, I'm coming from a totally different background, that is BCom honors, and that is totally out of the radar of a public policy. But listening to you and other experts over the three days have given me immense exposure, as well as the, I would say, confidence to come forward in this area and learn and explore more. And I think I would be able to work in this particular area and not in the area in which I'm studying. So I think it was much necessary, and these courses like public policy and more awareness policies should be promoted, so that people who are not into this area or who are not aware should get aware, and we can get the best of the minds towards this policy making.
Yeah, well said, Bhanvi. Actually, I could see it myself. You know, it's today's Bhanvi is not the one that I met 3 days ago. You're much more confident. You're speaking much more cogently. Congratulations. Yeah, she's actually grown up in these 3 days.
No certificate required.
Thank you, ma'am.
Okay, Priyanka has raised hand. Priyanka, and then
Yes, Priyanka.
Yes, ma'am. So I come from an environmental studies background, and I hail from Uttarakhand, and I'm very much attached to the climate change issue and raising concern. And I've always understood that policy plays a very important role, especially with such fragile ecosystems that we come from, regarding all of the development that takes place during the duration of this 3-day course. I was immensely happy to notice that every speaker made sure to include climate change as a part of discussing policy and that is something for somebody like me. I'm not from a public policy background. Prior to the environmental perspective of it, maybe I hadn't even given that much of a thought, had not addressed policy being such an important part of our everyday life. And my main aim with even being connected to IMPRI was to gain more knowledge in this particular area, and especially more and more about how do we in the environmental realm, how much role does a policy play, and how I always wanted to learn how do you create such policies, and the whole process of it, considering the stakeholders and every aspect of it. And it brought me immense joy to hear everybody addressing the issue and bringing it to such forefront while discussing the careers that are possible. So I'd like to thank everybody who basically gave us so much knowledge about this.
Priyanka, since you're working in the area of, and you hope to work in the area of climate change and disaster management and so on, one word of caution. Something that's coming to my notice often these days is that a lot of false data and information floats around. So be very perceptive. Be careful what you are looking at, and take it with a big pinch of salt if the source is not known. In fact, I don't know if I mentioned this example ever. I don't know. I don't think in the last 3 days I have. I forget. But I have seen papers. I have seen project reports produced by the multilateral agencies that have such glaring false data, that have such contradictions. We were doing a project. I was doing the evaluation of a project in Kerala in Silent Valley. And we found that the project actually said that the number of, what is it called? The giant squirrels would go down by 40% at the end of 3 years if you do that project, if you implement that project. So why do that project? Nobody had even read it. Even the UNDP who was doing the project had not applied their mind to it. So we are actually implementing a project which would increase the number of protected species by almost half. And yet nobody looked at it. So it's you guys who need to be cautious and very, very careful on these matters. And I don't know how many of you read these, but I read a lot of it these days. A lot of attempt is being made to portray a lot of bad things in India. You know, things are not going as well as it should, etc. Yes, a lot of things maybe are not going as it should, but there are a lot of things that are going as much better than what we thought. And by putting in false figures, you're actually doing more harm than good. And it's extremely dishonest. So keep that in mind when you do work on climate change.
Thank you, ma'am.
Yes, Manvi.
Thank you, ma'am, for giving us an opportunity to learn from your vast experience. And I would especially thank.
Aditi ji has also raised hand. Aditi Chaudhary ji, you have raised your hand.
Yeah, am I audible?
Please go
Yes,
ahead.
you are, Aditi.
Good evening, everyone. First of all, thanks a lot for this amazing session, this amazing workshop, actually. So I have just graduated from Miranda House last year, and I have been preparing for civil services since last year. So, and my optional is public administration. And listening to these conversations, it has actually cemented my understanding. And I think I would be able to use all these examples in my answer also. It has basically helped me in understanding everything. So I basically want to build my career at the intersection of public policy as well as international affairs. I want to combine both the things. So due to this workshop, I actually gained clarity for that, because I was really lost before. I was interested in public policy also, but I was also passionate about international relations and diplomacy. I want to join actually foreign service. So yeah, this was really great and amazing. I think even after studying for the entire day, I had the energy to attend these sessions. It was really, I really felt at home, in DU we used to have such elaborate discussions every other day. So I was kind of missing that, and this filled that vacuum. I'm so glad that I found this I found out about this think tank and about all the workshops that you are conducting. And Nivedita ma'am, you are such an inspiration. You're like, I've been so enthralled with everything that you've been telling since that day. So overall, thanks a lot, everyone. You are doing a great job. Thanks a lot.
And Nivedita ma'am can guide also on the optionals, ma'am, since you are from services. A lot of, I mean, 80% of researchers we get at IMPRI, all are in this dilemma, even not preparing for services, but they like IR, they like this, they like three things at a time. And very tough to zero it down. So how do you see that how to approach this thing? It's a very lovely question by Aditi. Thank you, Aditi.
Yeah, but you cannot really zero it down ever, Arjunji. You always should have a plan B and a plan C, so that, and the civil services is a gamble. It's, you just don't know who gets in. When I see at the interview board, when I see the candidates, I sometimes wonder, how did this person really get through? So, it's maybe the person got questions that the person knew the answers of, or I don't know. But don't put all your eggs in one basket. And frankly, I feel that especially in modern times, maybe not so much 20, 30 years back when I joined the service, but now there are so many other options in which options for working in the area of public policy making, public service, even public law. These are areas which are growing areas. So even if you are not in the service, in fact, maybe you can do much better work outside than within the civil service sometimes. I feel I'm doing much better, much more now sometimes. Yes. Any other questions? I think there's one more hand up. Mansi.
Yes. Janvi ji have also. Okay, Mansi, you go first.
Yes, ma'am. I would like to thank for this amazing session. Like, I come from an urban planning background. Like, I pursued my master's in urban and regional planning. This year itself, I completed it. So, like, this session is very helpful for me in the terms of like, जो भी urban development हो रही है, and that intersects with the government policies. And also, जो भी नए tools आ रहे हैं, like AI. How these are helping in developing like policies, decision making, and all the things is मतलब बहुत ज़्यादा amazing session था.
And that's one of the critical areas for our country now, Mansi.
Yes, ma'am.
You see what's happening, whether it's urban floods, whether it is traffic issues, whether it is pollution. I think our urban cities are imploding, some of them.
Yes, ma'am.
Good, that's excellent area to work in.
And there is one more from Janvi ji.
Yes.
Janvi ji, you can unmute if you want to. Or Banvi, you can.
So she said she just wanted to thank IMPRI and all the experts, as all the three sessions gave a lot of clarity to me, and how she should approach the field of public policy. And also she is pursuing law, but wasn't really sure if she want to have a career as a litigation or in judiciary or corporate. So this course gave her a perspective or vision on how can she put law and public policy together to create a better career opportunity for herself.
Good. I think kudos to Dr. Arjun and your team. You've done an excellent work, getting the group of speakers, putting the sessions in a manner that was extremely cohesive. I think you've done very good work. And of course, the icing on the cake was Bhanvi.
Right. My only suggestion to all the participants would be that have the eagerness to learn at whatever stage you are, because even now, even I have to write and learn codes just like 10, 11, 12 class student, always be data or any other thing. Get yourself more educated. If you've not done masters, if you're waiting for it, or PhD or any other learning programs, keep on doing that. That is some exercise which keeps you motivated in a very different manner, which you cannot imagine. So mingle up more and learn from each other and all the experts, which whatever opportunity you get. Great. I think we can wrap up now.
Yes.
Nice session. Bani, over to you.
Thank you once again, ma'am. And I would especially thank you for chairing this session. And I wish we could have, we wish we could be joining for future events as well. So with your permission, I would like to give the final vote of thanks, ma'am.
Yeah.
Ma'am, with your permission, I would like to give the final vote of thanks for
Yes,
our.
yes, go ahead.
So as we come to the end of day 3 of Careers in Public Policy, an online national monsoon workshop program, a 3-day immersive online introductory, career counseling, and awareness certificate training workshop, I, Dhanvi, researcher at IMPRI, Impact and Policy Research Institute, would like to propose a formal vote of thanks on behalf of IMPRI, New Delhi. And we are grateful to our experts for day 3 session, Dr. Nivedita ma'am, Mr. Sandeep ji, and Yash Agarwal, for taking out their valuable time and giving us an opportunity as well as to the participants to learn from this online certificate program. And we thank all our participants who have raised pertinent questions and actively participated in today's deliberation. We are grateful if you are watching us later on YouTube or listening to us on our various podcasts or reading our publications. And for the certificates part, we will be sharing a feedback form for you to provide your details as for the certificates and obtain your feedback and suggestions. Please mention your name correctly for the purpose of handing out the certificates. We have shared the recorded video of the training program in your email for your kind perusal and in case you missed the live sessions. Thanks to the organizing team IMPRI for conducting the whole session in a smooth manner. And we hope you continue to join in future to our IMPRI Web Policy Talk and Web Policy Learning. Wishing you a good day. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you,
Thank you, ma'am.
Dr. Arjun.
Thank you, Nathan. Thank you. Have a good night.
You too. Good night.